Somewhere around 1900 before the Common Era, one of the largest civilizations the world had ever known began to vanish. It did not burn. It did not fall to an invading army. There was no great war, no recorded plague, no volcanic eruption that can be pinpointed as the cause. Over the span of roughly 200 years, a civilization that had sustained as many as 5 million people across an area of 1.3 million square kilometers, quietly, methodically, almost deliberately ceased to exist. The cities emptied, the workshops closed, the writing system, whatever it recorded, was no longer used. The standardized weights and measures that had governed trade across a subcontinental area fell into disuse. The drainage systems that had kept the cities clean, systems more advanced than anything the world would see again for 2,000 years, were left to clog with dirt and debris, and then the people walked away. They dispersed into smaller communities, moved eastward and southward, and within a few generations forgot that the great cities had ever existed. This was the Harappan civilization, also called the Indus Valley Civilization, and its disappearance is one of the most profound unsolved mysteries in the history of humanity. We are not talking about a minor settlement. We are not talking about one city or a handful of villages that failed to thrive. The Harappan civilization, at its peak between 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, was the largest of the three great civilizations of the ancient Bronze Age world, larger in geographical extent than ancient Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia. It encompassed more than 1,400 known sites, including at least 5 major cities, each one a marvel of urban planning and engineering. Its trade networks reached from the Arabian Sea to the highlands of Afghanistan, from the coast of Oman to the cities of Sumer. Its artisans produced some of the finest beadwork, metalwork, and pottery of the ancient world. Its engineers designed cities with grid-planned streets, indoor plumbing, and centralized sewage systems that would not be matched in Europe until the 19th century. And then, in a span of time shorter than the age of most modern nations, it was gone. The disappearance is made more haunting by a single, devastating fact. The Harappan people had a writing system. They inscribed symbols on thousands of small stone seals, on pottery, on tablets, on copper plates. We have found these inscriptions at sites across the entire civilization, but we cannot read them. The Harappan script, despite more than a century of effort by linguists and cryptographers, remains undeciphered. We cannot read their laws, their prayers, their histories, their complaints, their explanations of what was happening to their world. We cannot read their farewell. Whatever they knew about their own disappearance, whatever they recorded about the changes overtaking their civilization, is locked inside a code that no one alive knows how to break. This silence is not merely an academic frustration. It is the central obstacle to understanding one of the most important events in ancient history. Every theory about the Harappan disappearance, every explanation offered by archaeologists, climate scientists, and historians must be built from physical evidence alone: bones and bricks, soil samples and satellite imagery, the chemical composition of ancient snail shells and the pollen grains preserved in lake sediments. We are reconstructing the death of a civilization without a single written testimony from anyone who lived through it. It is detective work of the most difficult kind, conducted across a crime scene that is 4,000 years old and 1.3 million square kilometers wide. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what the current evidence tells us about the disappearance of the Harappan civilization. You are going to see how shifting rivers, a weakening monsoon, the collapse of trade networks, and the failure of social institutions combine to unravel a world that had thrived for 700 years. You are going to confront what this disappearance means for our understanding of how civilizations die, and why this particular death, quiet, gradual, almost peaceful, may be the most unsettling kind of all. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Harappan civilization was not destroyed. It was dissolved. It was not conquered. It was abandoned. And the people who abandoned it did not leave behind a single readable word explaining why. That silence has echoed across 4,000 years. Tonight, we listen to what the silence can tell us. There is something uniquely disturbing about a civilization that disappears without violence. We can understand conquest. We can understand catastrophe. We can process the fall of a city to a besieging army or the destruction of a people by plague. These are dramatic events with clear causes and vivid narratives. But a civilization that simply dissolves, that watches its own institutions decay, that witnesses the gradual emptying of its cities and the slow forgetting of its skills, and yet leaves no record of protest, no chronicle of despair, no written cry for help, this is something different. This is not a story of defeat. It is a story of departure. And departure, when it involves 5 million people and one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, raises questions that go far beyond the boundaries of archaeology. Now, let's begin. To understand how the Harappan civilization disappeared, we must first understand what it was when it was alive. And to do that, we must trace its origins, measure its extent, and catalogue its achievements with the precision that the subject demands. Because the scale of what was lost can only be appreciated when the scale of what existed is fully grasped. The story begins in the river plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, in the vast alluvial lowlands formed by the Indus River and its tributaries. According to current archaeological models, the earliest settled communities in this region date to approximately 7,000 before the Common Era, during the period known as the Neolithic. These were small farming villages, cultivating wheat and barley, raising cattle and goats, and producing simple pottery and stone tools. Over the next several thousand years, these communities grew slowly in size, complexity, and interconnection. By approximately 3,300 before the Common Era, the region entered what archaeologists call the early Harappan phase, a period of accelerating urbanization and cultural integration that laid the groundwork for the civilization that would follow. The transformation from scattered farming villages to a unified civilization was neither sudden nor uniform. It unfolded over several centuries, driven by a combination of agricultural surplus, trade, and the development of shared cultural practices. The early Harappan period saw the emergence of regional centers, towns that were larger and more complex than the surrounding villages, with evidence of craft specialization, long-distance trade, and the beginnings of the standardization that would later define the mature Harappan period. Pottery styles became more uniform. Architectural conventions began to spread. The first signs of the distinctive Harappan brick ratio, 4:2:1, in length, width, and height appeared. By approximately 2600 before the Common Era, this process of integration had produced something unprecedented. The mature Harappan phase had begun. Across an area stretching from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the coast of Gujarat in the south, from the border of Iran in the west to the upper reaches of the Ganges-Yamuna plain in the east, a single, coherent civilization had emerged. It was unified not by a common language, as far as we know, nor by a single religion, nor by the military power of a conquering ruler, but by shared material culture, standardized bricks, uniform weights and measures, common seal iconography, consistent urban planning principles, and a shared writing system. The numbers alone convey the scale. The mature Harappan civilization occupied roughly 1.3 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, consider that the core territory of ancient Egypt, the narrow strip of fertile land along the Nile, covered approximately 34,000 square kilometers. The heartland of Mesopotamian civilization, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, encompassed roughly 120,000 square kilometers. The Harappan civilization was approximately 10 times larger than Mesopotamia and nearly 40 times larger than the core of Egypt. It was by a significant margin the largest civilization of the Bronze Age world. If a person were to walk from the northernmost known Harappan site to the southernmost, traveling at a pace of 30 kilometers per day, the journey would take roughly 40 days. East to west, it would take roughly 35 days. This was not a city-state. This was not a compact kingdom centered on a single river valley. This was a subcontinental civilization dispersed across mountains, deserts, river plains, and coastal regions, held together by shared standards and shared practices maintained across distances that, in the Bronze Age, must have seemed almost incomprehensible. Population estimates for the mature Harappan period vary widely, ranging from 1 million to 5 million people. The most commonly cited figure is approximately 5 million, though conservative estimates place it closer to 2 or 3 million. Even at the lower end, this represents an enormous population for the Bronze Age. To sustain this many people required sophisticated agricultural practices capable of producing large surpluses. The Harappans cultivated wheat, barley, peas, sesame, dates, and cotton. They were among the earliest known cultivators of cotton in the world. They raised cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goats. Their agricultural success was the foundation on which everything else was built. The cities, the trade networks, the craft workshops, the elaborate infrastructure. The discovery of the Harappan civilization is itself a story of lost and found knowledge. The civilization was so thoroughly forgotten that when its ruins were first encountered by Europeans in the 19th century, no one recognized what they were. Charles Masson, a British Army deserter traveling under an assumed name, described the ruins of Harappa in 1826 as the remnants of a fortified city, but he had no framework for understanding its true age or significance. For decades, the bricks of Harappa were quarried by local residents for construction and by engineers building the Lahore Multan Railway for track ballast. Thousands of years of architectural achievement were being ground up for railroad gravel before anyone realized what was being destroyed. Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, visited Harappa in 1856 and recovered artifacts including one of the distinctive Harappan seals. But even Cunningham did not grasp the age of the ruins. It was not until 1921 and 1922 when Dayaram Sani began systematic excavations at Harappa and Rakhold Daspanerji discovered Mohenjo-Daro 600 kilometers to the south that the scale of the discovery became apparent. Sir John Marshall, Director General of the Archaeological Survey, recognized that these two distant sites were part of a single civilization and announced the discovery to the world in 1924. The announcement rewrote the history of the ancient world. There were not two great cradles of early civilization, there were three. What the excavations revealed was a civilization unlike anything that had been expected. Where archaeologists trained in Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions expected palaces, temples, and monumental royal statuary, they found drains, wells, and standardized bricks. Where they expected the material evidence of kingship and military power, they found the infrastructure of civic welfare. The Harappan civilization presented a puzzle that a century of subsequent research has only deepened. A complex, sophisticated, and geographically vast society that left behind almost no evidence of the hierarchical governance structures that characterized every other ancient civilization of comparable scale. More than 1,400 Harappan sites have been identified through archaeological survey and excavation. Of these, 5 stand out as major urban centres: Mohenjo-Daro in Sindh, Harappa in Punjab, Ganweriwala in Cholistan, Rahigahi in Haryana, and Dholavira in Gujarat. Each of these cities covered an area of roughly 100 hectares or more. Each was built on a grid plan with wide main streets, narrower residential lanes, and integrated drainage systems. Each showed evidence of public architecture, craft production, and long-distance trade. Mohenjo-Daro, the best excavated of the 5, was a city of perhaps 30 to 50,000 people. Its streets ran north to south and east to west in a precise grid. Its houses were built of standardized fired bricks. Nearly every house had a private bathing area and toilet connected to covered drains running beneath the streets. The drains were fitted with removable covers for inspection and sump pits for sediment collection. Fresh water was provided by wells, hundreds of them, distributed throughout the city so that no household was far from a water source. The Great Bath, located on the raised citadel mound, was a large waterproof pool that may have served a ritual or communal function. The engineering was superb. The pool was sealed with a layer of natural bitumen between 2 courses of brick, creating a waterproof sandwich that prevented leakage even under considerable hydrostatic pressure. The floor sloped toward a corner drain, that allowed the pool to be emptied and cleaned. Steps at both ends provided access into the water. Surrounding rooms may have served as changing areas or private bathing chambers. The civic priorities were unmistakable. The most prominent public building in the city's most prominent location was not a throne room or a temple dedicated to a warrior god. It was a bathing facility. Nearby stood a large structure that archaeologists have called the granary, though this identification is disputed. The building sits on a platform of massive mud brick blocks, with air channels running between them, which were initially interpreted as ventilation passages for stored grain. Later researchers have challenged this interpretation, noting that no actual grain was found in the building, and that the air channels may have served structural rather than storage purposes. The building might have been a warehouse, an assembly hall, or something entirely different. The debate about the granary illustrates a broader challenge in Harappan archaeology. Without readable inscriptions, the function of even the largest buildings must be inferred from form alone, and form is an unreliable guide when dealing with a culture whose architectural conventions were fundamentally different from anything in the Western or Near Eastern experience. Harappa, the city that gave the civilization its name, was of comparable size and sophistication. Located on the Ravi River in what is now Pakistan's Punjab province, it was first noted by Charles Masson in 1826 and first systematically excavated beginning in 1920. Harappa showed the same features as Mohenjo-Daro: grid streets, standardized bricks, covered drains, public buildings on a raised citadel. But Harappa also provided evidence that Mohenjo-Daro, due to its high water table, could not. Burials. The cemetery areas at Harappa have yielded hundreds of graves, providing information about diet, health, social status, and burial practices that is unavailable at most other Harappan sites. Dholavira, located on the island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch in Gujarat, added another dimension to our understanding. This city had a sophisticated water management system consisting of a series of rock-cut reservoirs designed to capture monsoon rainfall and store it for use during the long dry season. In a region where surface water was scarce, the people of Dholavira engineered a solution that allowed them to sustain an urban population in an otherwise inhospitable environment. Dholavira also yielded one of the most tantalizing artifacts in all of Harappan archaeology: a large signboard consisting of 10 Indus script symbols, each roughly 37 centimeters tall, originally mounted above one of the city's gateways. It is the largest known Harappan inscription and the only one clearly meant for public display. If we could read those 10 symbols, we might know the city's name, its governing authority, or the institution housed behind the gate. We cannot. The symbols remain silent. The trade networks of the Harappan civilization were extensive and well documented through archaeological evidence. Harappan seals, those distinctive square stamp seals carved with animal images and Indus script, have been found at sites in Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, and Central Asia. At the Mesopotamian city of Harappan seals were found alongside local cylinder seals, evidence of direct commercial contact between the two civilizations. The Mesopotamians recorded trade with a distant land they called Meluha, which most scholars identify as the Harappan realm. Cuneiform texts describe Meluha as a source of exotic goods, including carnelian, ivory, and timber. Some texts mention Meluhan interpreters living in Mesopotamian cities, suggesting sustained, long-term commercial relationships. The coastal settlement of Lothal in present-day Gujarat provides evidence of maritime trade. Archaeologists discovered what appears to be an ancient dockyard, a rectangular basin measuring approximately 219 meters long and 37 meters wide, connected to an ancient river channel. If this interpretation is correct, Lothal was one of the earliest known port facilities in the world. Ships carrying Harappan goods would have departed from here for the Arabian coast and the Persian Gulf, linking the Indus Valley to the broader commercial world of the ancient Near East. The goods exchanged included cotton textiles, carnelian beads, ivory, timber, and possibly tin and copper. In return, the Harappans received silver, wool, and other materials scarce in the Indus region. The carnelian bead workshops deserve special mention because they illustrate the level of craft sophistication that the Harappan world achieved. Long barrel-shaped carnelian beads, some over 10 centimeters in length, were produced through a process that required careful selection of raw stone, controlled heating to enhance color, shaping by grinding on stone surfaces, and drilling with slender copper drills using abrasive sand. A single bead could take days to produce. The finished products were among the most valued luxury goods in the ancient Near East, and they have been found in royal tombs at in Mesopotamia, hundreds of kilometers from the workshops where they were made. The skill, patience, and knowledge required to produce these beads represent centuries of accumulated craft expertise, passed from master to apprentice across generations. The weight system of the Harappan civilization provides further evidence of the civilization's organizational sophistication. Precisely cut and polished stone cubes, following a binary decimal progression, have been found at sites across the entire civilization. The weights are accurate to within fractions of a percent. A weight from Mohenjo-Daro matches a weight from Lothal, over 700 kilometers away, with a precision that speaks to rigorous quality control and centralized standardization. These weights were tools of trade, instruments of fairness, and evidence of an authority, whatever its nature, that maintained honest measurement across an area larger than most modern nations. The apparent absence of militarism in the Harappan civilization is one of its most distinctive and debated features. Unlike Egypt, whose art is filled with depictions of pharaohs smiting enemies and armies marching to war, and unlike Mesopotamia, where kings recorded their conquests on stone monuments and palace walls, the Harappan archaeological record contains almost no depictions of warfare. There are no scenes of battle, no triumphal monuments, no mass graves of warriors, no hordes of weapons. The city walls that exist at some Harappan sites appear to have been designed primarily for flood control rather than military defense. Some scholars, including the late Gregory Possil, have described the Harappan civilization as uniquely peaceful among ancient complex societies, a characterization that, if accurate, raises profound questions about the relationship between military power and civilizational achievement. The governance of the Harappan civilization remains perhaps its deepest mystery. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, no monumental statuary of rulers. The buildings on the citadel mounds of the major cities appear to be public facilities rather than royal residences. The burials that have been excavated, primarily at Harappa, are simple, with modest grave goods that show no dramatic differences in wealth or status. Some scholars have proposed that the civilization was governed by a priestly class, drawing parallels to the theocratic systems of Mesopotamia. Others suggest governance by merchant guilds or councils of elders. Still others propose a form of collective or heterarchical governance, in which power was distributed among multiple competing or cooperating groups rather than concentrated in a single ruler. The debate has continued for over a century without resolution, largely because the evidence needed to resolve it, written records of governance, has either not survived or cannot be read. The civilization's writing system, found on thousands of seals and other objects, remains the great unsolved puzzle. The Indus script consists of between 400 and 600 distinct symbols. Inscriptions are typically very short, averaging fewer than 5 symbols, with the longest known inscription containing only 26 symbols. More than a century of decipherment attempts have failed. Without the ability to read the script, we cannot access the thoughts, beliefs, laws, or histories of the Harappan people. Every interpretation of their civilization must be inferred from material evidence, from bricks and bones, from pottery and plumbing, from the silent testimony of objects that tell us what was built, but not what was thought. We cannot even know what the Harappans called themselves. The names we use, Harappan, Indus Valley, are modern labels assigned by archaeologists. The civilization's own name for itself is lost, perhaps inscribed on one of the thousands of seals that we hold in our hands and cannot read. Compare this silence to what we know about other ancient civilizations. When the Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed around 2150 before the Common Era, we have texts describing the chaos. The admonitions of Ipuwer describe social upheaval and famine in vivid detail. When Mesopotamian cities fell, Clay tablets recorded the pleas of starving citizens and the boasts of conquering kings. When Rome declined, historians on both sides of the frontier documented the process across centuries of written commentary. The Harappan civilization left behind nothing comparable, no lament, no chronicle, no political analysis of what went wrong, not even a king's name carved on a wall to prove that kings existed. The silence surrounding the Harappan disappearance is total, and total silence surrounding an event of this magnitude is itself the most eloquent testimony to the depth of the loss. The numbers are striking when we attempt to measure the Harappan achievement against the scale of a human lifetime. If we estimate a generation at roughly 25 years, then the mature Harappan period lasted for approximately 28 generations. 28 generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, refined and improved with each passing century. When the civilization collapsed, that entire inheritance, 700 years of engineering expertise, trade protocol, agricultural technique, and administrative practice, was dispersed and eventually lost. What took 28 generations to accumulate took perhaps 8 generations to forget. The asymmetry between building and losing is one of the most sobering facts about human civilization. Creation is slow, destruction, or in this case abandonment, is fast. Consider one more comparison to grasp the time depth involved. 700 years before our present day, Europe was in the early 1400s. The Renaissance had barely begun. The Americas were unknown to Europeans. The printing press had not been invented. If a civilization had begun at that point and survived continuously until today, it would have witnessed every major event of the modern era. The mature Harappan period lasted that long. It was not a flash in the archaeological pan. It was a sustained, multi-century achievement comparable in duration to the entire modern era of Western civilization. And yet it ended, and it was forgotten so completely that the modern world did not learn of its existence until barely a century ago. The Harappan approach to urban water management was not limited to Mohenjo-Daro. At Harappa, archaeologists found a similar system of drains, wells, and bathing facilities. At Lothal, the dockyard site in Gujarat, the water management extended to the control of tidal flows for maritime purposes. At Dolavira, the rock-cut reservoirs represented a different engineering approach, adapted to a different environmental challenge, demonstrating that the Harappan commitment to water management was not a single solution applied everywhere, but a principle adapted to local conditions. This adaptive quality suggests a civilization that understood water management at a conceptual level, not just as a set of fixed techniques, and could apply that understanding creatively to new situations. The agricultural foundations of the civilization were equally sophisticated. The Harappans cultivated a diverse range of crops, including wheat, barley, peas, chickpeas, sesame, and cotton. They also grew rice in some regions, particularly in Gujarat and the eastern areas. This crop diversity provided a buffer against the failure of any single crop. If the wheat harvest failed, the barley might still succeed. If the rain-fed crops failed, the irrigated crops near the river might still yield. This diversity was itself a form of insurance against environmental variability, a practical expression of the same principle that modern agricultural scientists call crop diversification. The Harappans were also among the earliest known cultivators of cotton, a crop that would become one of the most important in world history. Cotton textiles were a major Harappan export, traded to Mesopotamia and other regions. The cultivation, spinning, weaving, and dyeing of cotton required an entire chain of specialized knowledge, from agricultural techniques for growing the plant to craft techniques for processing the fiber. Each link in this chain represented accumulated expertise passed from one generation to the next. When the civilization dissolved and the textile workshops closed, this entire chain of knowledge was disrupted, and the specific Harappan techniques for producing cotton textiles were lost. The Harappan civilization existed during one of the most dynamic periods in the ancient world. While the Harappans were building their grid-planned cities and trading carnelian beads to Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Giza were being constructed in Egypt. The first dynasties of Ur were establishing their power in Sumer, and the Minoan civilization of Crete was beginning its remarkable ascent. The Harappan world was not isolated. It was part of a network of interconnected Bronze Age civilizations that stretched from the Nile to the Indus, linked by maritime trade routes across the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, and by overland routes through Iran and Central Asia. The collapse of the Harappan civilization removed one of the largest and most productive nodes from this network, and the reverberations may have been felt across the entire ancient world, though the precise impact on other civilizations remains difficult to measure. This is the civilization that disappeared, a civilization of millions, a civilization that spanned a subcontinent, a civilization that built some of the most livable cities in the ancient world, traded with partners thousands of kilometers away, and maintained uniform standards of construction and measurement across an area that dwarfed its contemporaries. Understanding its disappearance requires understanding what was at stake. This was not the failure of a small experiment in settled life. This was the dissolution of one of humanity's greatest achievements. To understand how something so large, so complex, so apparently successful could simply cease to exist, we need to look at the forces that the Harappan world depended on, forces that seemed eternal, but were in truth catastrophically fragile. But what scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The sheer diversity of Harappan craftsmanship speaks to a society of extraordinary sophistication. Beyond the carnelian beads, Harappan artisans produced remarkable work in multiple media. Shell workers at the coastal site of Nageshwar and at Balakot carved conch shells into bangles, ladles, and decorative objects using techniques that required intimate knowledge of the material's structure. Metalworkers produced tools, weapons, vessels, and ornaments in copper and bronze, using both casting and hammering techniques. The famous bronze figurine from Mohenjo-Daro, known as the Dancing Girl, is a masterwork of lost wax casting, depicting a young woman standing in a relaxed, confident pose with bangles stacked along one arm. She is roughly 4,500 years old, and she projects an individuality and vitality that transcends the millennia. The terracotta figurines, found in abundance at Harappan sites, present another dimension of Harappan creativity. Many depict women adorned with elaborate headdresses and jewelry. Others represent animals, including bulls, dogs, birds, and the distinctive humped bull that appears frequently in Harappan iconography. Some figurines appear to be toys, including small carts with movable wheels, among the earliest known wheeled toys in the world. The variety and abundance of these figurines suggest a culture rich in domestic ritual, play, and artistic expression, even if the specific meanings of the figurines remain beyond our ability to interpret. The Harappan approach to urban sanitation deserves emphasis because it represents what may be the civilization's most lasting contribution to the concept of urban life. In most ancient cities, waste management was an afterthought at best. In Mesopotamian cities, waste was typically dumped in courtyards or streets. In Egyptian settlements, sanitation was rudimentary. Even in the planned workers' village at Deir el-Medina, which housed the artisans who built the royal tombs, there was no centralized drainage. Only the Harappans built cities in which waste management was integrated into the urban plan from the beginning, in which every household had access to covered drains, and in which a system of regular maintenance kept the infrastructure functioning. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro exemplifies this commitment to water management as a civic priority. Located at the highest and most prominent point of the city, on the Citadel Mound, the Great Bath was a large waterproof pool measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. It was sealed with a layer of natural bitumen between two courses of brick, creating a waterproof barrier that prevented leakage. The floor sloped toward a drain that allowed the pool to be emptied for cleaning. Steps at both ends provided access. The engineering was sophisticated, and the prominent placement suggested that communal bathing held a significance in Harappan culture that went beyond mere hygiene. Many scholars have drawn connections to the ritual bathing practices that remain central to religious life in South Asia today, suggesting a continuity of practice, if not of specific belief, across 4,000 years. There is an important point about the Harappan civilization that is often overlooked in popular accounts. The civilization was not monolithic, it was diverse. Different regions had different local traditions, different environmental adaptations, different economic specializations. Coastal Gujarat had a maritime economy oriented towards seafaring trade. The Punjab heartland was an agricultural powerhouse dependent on the Ravi and other Indus tributaries. The Gagra-Hakra region sustained dense agricultural communities on a monsoon-fed floodplain. The eastern frontier, in what is now Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, represented the advancing edge of Harappan cultural influence into the Ganges-Yamuna plain. This regional diversity was bound together by the shared standards, the standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the common seal iconography that defined Harappan identity. When those shared standards dissolved during the period of decline, the regional diversity that had existed beneath the surface re-emerged, and the once unified civilization fragmented into multiple distinct regional cultures. This fragmentation was not a sudden shattering, but a gradual unraveling. The shared standards that had bound the civilization together were maintained by networks of trade, communication, and mutual obligation. As these networks weakened under environmental pressure, the centripetal forces that held the regions together were overcome by the centrifugal forces that pulled them apart. Each region reverted to its own local traditions, its own architectural styles, its own pottery forms. The uniformity that had been the hallmark of Harappan culture gave way to diversity, and with that diversity came the loss of the very thing that had made the civilization a civilization, its shared identity. The social organization of the Harappan civilization remains one of its most debated aspects. There are no palaces at any excavated Harappan site, no royal tombs filled with gold and sacrificial attendants, as found at Ur in Mesopotamia, no colossal statues of rulers, as found in Egypt, no reliefs depicting military victories or divine kingship. The largest and most prominent buildings at Harappan cities are public structures, the Great Bath, the so-called granary, assembly halls, and what appear to be civic facilities. The residential architecture shows variation in size, with some houses considerably larger than others, suggesting differences in wealth. But the differences are modest compared to the extremes of wealth and poverty visible in contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. The burial evidence, primarily from Harappa, where the cemetery areas have been most thoroughly excavated, reinforces the impression of relative equality. Graves contain modest goods, a few ceramic vessels, personal ornaments of shell or semi-precious stone, occasionally a copper mirror or tool. There are no royal burials, no graves stuffed with gold and lapis lazuli, no evidence of human sacrifice accompanying the burial of important individuals. The dead were buried simply, without the extravagant display of wealth and power that characterized elite burials in every other ancient civilization of comparable scale. This relative equality, if genuine, and not merely an artifact of incomplete excavation, carries profound implications for how we understand the relationship between power, planning, and civic achievement. In every other ancient civilization known to archaeology, large-scale public works, whether pyramids, ziggurats, or aqueducts, were produced by centralized hierarchical authority. Kings commanded, workers obeyed. The built environment reflected this concentration of power. But Mohenjo-Daro's drains served every household. Its wells provided water to every neighborhood. Its streets were planned for the benefit of the entire community. If this was achieved without a king, without a military command structure, without the coercive apparatus of the state, then the conventional assumption that hierarchy is necessary for civilizational achievement must be questioned. Some scholars have proposed alternative models of governance. Gregory Possehl suggested the concept of a faceless civilization, one in which authority was distributed rather than concentrated. Jonathan Mark Kenoyer has proposed a model of competitive cooperation, in which multiple elite groups vied for influence through trade, craft patronage, and public works rather than through military conquest. Others have suggested governance by merchant guilds, priestly councils, or assemblies of elders. None of these proposals can be confirmed or denied with the evidence currently available. The undeciphered script guards its secrets, and the buildings that might have housed the governing authority, whatever form it took, either have not been found or cannot be distinguished from the other public structures on the citadel mounds. The Harappan civilization's apparent peacefulness is another distinctive feature that separates it from its contemporaries. The archaeological record contains almost no depictions of warfare or violence. No battle scenes, no triumph monuments, no weapon hordes. The walls surrounding some Harappan cities appear to have been designed primarily for flood control rather than military defense. This absence of militarism is so consistent and so complete that some scholars have described the Harappan civilization as uniquely peaceful among ancient complex societies. If true, this raises extraordinary questions about human social possibility, about whether warfare is an inevitable feature of complex civilization or merely one option among many. The evidence for this interpretation is not conclusive. Some scholars argue that the absence of military imagery reflects artistic convention rather than social reality, that the Harappans may have fought wars but chose not to depict them. Others note that weapons, though rare, have been found at Harappan sites, including copper and bronze spearheads and arrowheads that could have served military as well as hunting purposes, and a small number of skeletal remains show evidence of violent injury. Though whether this reflects interpersonal violence, accident, or warfare is impossible to determine without additional context. The debate about Harappan peacefulness matters because it affects how we interpret the disappearance. If the civilization was indeed peaceful, its dissolution without violence becomes less surprising. A society without a warrior elite, without a military tradition, without leaders invested in holding territory at all costs, might simply disperse when conditions deteriorated, choosing survival over conflict. If, on the other hand, the civilization experienced warfare that we have not yet detected in the archaeological record, then the disappearance takes on a different character, perhaps involving conflict over dwindling resources that left no visible trace in cities that were subsequently abandoned. The central question of the Harappan disappearance can be stated with deceptive simplicity. Between approximately 1900 and 1700, before the Common Era, the great cities of the Harappan civilization were abandoned. The standardized systems that had unified the civilization for 7 centuries broke down. The population dispersed into smaller, simpler communities. The craft traditions declined. The writing system fell out of use. Within a few generations, the memory of the cities was lost. The question is, what caused this? For decades, the dominant answer was invasion. In 1947, the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler proposed that the civilization had been destroyed by invading Aryan tribes from Central Asia. Wheeler was a commanding figure in 20th century archaeology, brilliant and charismatic, and his theory carried enormous influence. He pointed to a group of skeletons found scattered in the upper levels of Mohenjo-Daro as evidence of a final massacre. He described scenes of desperate flight, of people cut down in the streets by conquerors wielding bronze weapons. He connected this to passages in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest Sanskrit texts, which describes the god Indra as a destroyer of fortified cities and a conqueror of dark-skinned enemies. The theory was dramatic. It was compelling. It connected archaeological evidence to ancient textual tradition. It seemed to explain both the end of the Harappan civilization and the beginning of the Vedic culture that would eventually give rise to Hinduism. And it was wrong. The invasion theory began to collapse under the weight of contrary evidence almost as soon as it was proposed. The skeletons Wheeler cited were found in different archaeological layers at Mohenjo-Daro, meaning they did not all die at the same time. They could not represent a single massacre. Some of the skeletons showed signs of chronic disease and malnutrition rather than violent death. The positioning of the bodies was inconsistent with sudden massacre. There were no burned buildings, no breached fortifications, no arrow-scored walls, no layers of ash indicating military assault. There were no mass graves of fallen warriors. The cities showed signs of gradual decline over centuries, not sudden destruction in a single event. George Dales, an American archaeologist who re-examined the evidence from Mohenjo-Daro in 1964, published a devastating critique titled The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-Daro. Dales argued that the bones told a story of gradual death from disease and privation, not sudden violence. The skeletons were scattered across multiple periods of occupation. Some had been deliberately buried, suggesting they were not the victims of an unburied massacre, but individuals who died of natural causes at different times. The invasion theory, Dales concluded, was a product of wishful interpretation, a dramatic narrative imposed on ambiguous evidence by an archaeologist who was looking for a dramatic story. Subsequent research has only strengthened the case against invasion. Genetic studies conducted in the 21st century, including a major analysis published in 2019 in the journal Science, using ancient DNA from hundreds of individuals across Central and South Asia, found no evidence of abrupt population replacement. The mixing of South Asian and Central Asian genetic lineages was gradual, spanning many centuries, consistent with slow migration and cultural diffusion rather than military conquest. The Harappan people were not slaughtered and replaced by newcomers. They were absorbed, slowly, over many generations, into the broader population movements that characterized the second millennium before the Common Era in South Asia. The decline of the invasion theory left a void that demanded filling. If not conquest, then what? What could have caused a civilization of such scale, such sophistication, such apparent stability to simply dissolve? The search for an answer has taken archaeologists into an alliance with climate scientists, geologists, and environmental historians that has produced one of the most compelling and disturbing accounts of civilizational collapse in the entire archaeological record. The breakthrough came from the study of ancient rivers. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers began using satellite imagery to map the river systems of the Indus Valley region. What they found reshaped the entire debate. The Indus River, which gives the civilization its modern name, was not the only major waterway in the region during the Harappan period. Alongside it, running roughly parallel through what is now the Thar Desert of Rajasthan and the dry plains of Cholistan in Pakistan, lay the unmistakable traces of another great river system. A wide, dry riverbed was visible from space as a distinct band of differently coloured soil, snaking across the landscape for hundreds of kilometres. This was the Gagar Hakra, a river that had once been a major waterway, but had at some point dried up and vanished entirely. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. Survey after survey, conducted over several decades by Indian and Pakistani archaeologists, revealed that more Harappan settlements were located along the Gagar Hakra than along the Indus itself. In some stretches, sites were spaced just a few kilometres apart, forming nearly continuous ribbons of habitation along the ancient riverbanks. This was not a minor tributary or a seasonal stream. It was a major artery of the civilization, possibly even its primary one. The civilization might more accurately be called the Indus-Gagahakra civilization, and the Gagahakra had dried up. The geological story of the river's decline has been pieced together through decades of painstaking research involving borehole samples, sediment analysis, remote sensing data, and geological mapping. The Gagahakra had once been fed by major Himalayan tributaries, particularly the Sutlej, whose waters originated in glacial melt in the high mountains. At some point, river capture, a well-documented geological process in which one river system diverts the headwaters of another, redirected the Sutlej into the Indus system to the west. The Yamuna, which may also have once contributed water to the Gagahakra, shifted eastward toward the Ganges. Deprived of its perennial water sources, the Gagahakra became dependent on monsoon rainfall alone. It went from a year-round river to a seasonal watercourse, flowing only during the monsoon months and dwindling to nothing during the long dry season. This transformation had profound implications. A perennial river provides water year-round, sustaining settlements through the dry months. A seasonal river provides water only during and shortly after the monsoon, requiring communities to develop storage systems and adjust their agricultural calendar. The communities that had built their lives along the Gagahakra now depended entirely on the monsoon, and the monsoon was about to fail them. A landmark study published in 2012 by Liviu Giozan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and a team of international researchers provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. Using geological surveys, satellite data, and careful analysis of ancient sediments, Giozan's team proposed that the Gagar Hakra had actually lost its Himalayan tributaries before the mature Harappan period began. This means the great civilization grew up along a river already in decline, attracted precisely because a gentler, monsoon-fed river was easier to manage than the powerful but flood-prone Indus. But this advantage was entirely contingent on one assumption, that the monsoon would remain stable. It did not. And it gets worse. The monsoon shifted. Multiple independent lines of scientific evidence point to a significant weakening of the Indian summer monsoon beginning around 4,200 years ago. This was not a local event. It was part of a global climatic episode known as the 4.2 kiloyear event that coincided with the collapse of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the fall of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, and widespread disruption across the Near East. In South Asia, the monsoon rains that had sustained the Gagga Hakra and irrigated the farmlands of hundreds of Harappan settlements weakened and became increasingly erratic. The evidence comes from multiple sources and is mutually reinforcing. Yama Dixit of Cambridge analysed oxygen isotope ratios in freshwater snail shells from the ancient lake of Kotla Dahar in Rajasthan, published in 2014. The chemistry is precise. When a lake receives less rainfall and evaporation increases, the oxygen isotope ratio in the water shifts, and this shift is recorded in the shells of organisms living in the lake. Dixit found clear evidence of increasing aridity beginning around 4,100 years ago. Anil Gupta of the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology found complementary evidence in sediment cores from the Arabian Sea. The abundance of wind-blown dust particles in the ocean sediments increased during this period, indicating drier conditions, stronger winds, and reduced vegetation cover on the South Asian mainland. The land was drying, the monsoon was weakening. Nick Scroxton of MIT, in a study published in 2018, added perhaps the most disturbing dimension. Analysing a stalagmite from Sahia Cave in Uttarakhand, his team found that the monsoon did not merely weaken, it became volatile. Year-to-year variability increased dramatically. Some years, the rains were adequate. Others, they failed almost entirely. This unpredictability may have been more destructive than straightforward drought. Agriculture requires planning. Seeds must be planted before the rains. Fields must be prepared weeks in advance. If the rains fail after planting, the entire crop and the invested labor are lost. Volatility turns every season into a gamble and undermines the basis of agricultural planning. The monsoon's failure did not just destroy agriculture, it disrupted the trade networks that had connected the Harappan world to the broader ancient economy. Many settlements along the Gagga Hakra were involved in craft production and long-distance trade. The bead workshops that produced carnelian exports for Mesopotamia required water for cutting and polishing. The riverine trade routes that connected inland settlements to coastal ports followed the river channels. When the river dried, the workshops lost water, the trade routes were severed, and the economic surplus that sustained urban life contracted. Evidence from Mesopotamian records suggests that references to Meluha, the presumed Harappan realm, decline after approximately 2000 before the Common Era. The distinctive Harappan seals found at Mesopotamian sites become rarer. The great trading relationship was being severed, not by war, but by the slow strangulation of the environmental and economic conditions that had sustained it. The loss of trade revenues would have further weakened the institutions that maintain the civilization's infrastructure and standards. But here is the problem. Climate change alone does not fully explain the disappearance. Other civilizations faced comparable droughts and survived. Egypt reconstituted itself after the first intermediate period. Mesopotamian societies adapted with sophisticated irrigation. Why did the Harappans not adapt? Part of the answers may lie in governance. The apparent absence of strong centralized authority, the lack of palaces, royal tombs, and military imagery may have been both a strength during stability and a fatal weakness during crisis. A decentralized society governed by consensus or by competing merchant guilds may function beautifully in normal times but lack the coercive power needed to mobilize populations for emergency measures. Building new irrigation systems, relocating settlements, rationing food supplies, redirecting labor to infrastructure repair. Crisis management requires swift, coordinated action that a consensus-based system may be unable to deliver. There is also the compound nature of the crisis. While the Gagahakra was drying in the east, the Indus was flooding in the west. Mohenjo-Daro shows clear evidence of repeated flood damage, with multiple layers of reconstruction rising above layers of river-deposited silt. Each rebuilding was slightly less careful than the one before, suggesting diminishing resources and diminishing will. The civilization was caught between drought and flood, its two great rivers failing simultaneously but in opposite ways. The result was a feedback loop of decline. Environmental stress reduced agricultural production. Reduced production weakened the economic base supporting urban institutions. Weakened institutions could not maintain infrastructure or coordinate responses. Failing infrastructure reduced productivity further, and so the cycle continued, each turn making recovery more difficult. The question of why the Harappan people did not build new irrigation systems or redirect existing water resources in response to the changing climate is one that demands careful consideration. The answer is not that they were incapable. The builders of Mohenjo-Daro's drainage system and Dolavira's rock-cut reservoirs clearly possessed the engineering knowledge to manipulate water on a large scale. The answer lies in the difference between maintaining existing infrastructure and creating entirely new systems under crisis conditions. Maintaining a drainage system requires regular, modest investments of labor, cleaning sump pits, replacing broken covers, repairing cracked pipes. These tasks can be performed by small teams on a routine basis. Building a new irrigation system, by contrast, requires a massive, coordinated mobilization of labor, materials, and planning. It requires surveying new terrain, calculating water flow over unfamiliar ground, excavating canals across kilometers of landscape, and doing all of this while the existing agricultural system is failing and the population is under stress. The engineering knowledge may have existed. The institutional capacity to deploy it under crisis conditions may not have. This distinction between knowledge and institutional capacity is crucial for understanding the Harappan collapse and civilizational collapses in general. A society may possess all the technical knowledge needed to solve its problems and still fail if it lacks the institutional mechanisms to translate that knowledge into coordinated action. Knowledge without organization is potential without realization. The Harappan engineers knew how to manage water, but managing water on the scale needed to respond to a subcontinental climate shift would have required organizational capacity that may have exceeded what the Harappan governance system, whatever its form, was designed to provide. The compound nature of the crisis further complicates the picture. The Harappans were not facing a single, well-defined problem that could be addressed with a single engineering solution. They were facing a constellation of interacting problems: drying rivers, erratic monsoons, flooding in some regions, drought in others, declining trade, deteriorating infrastructure, and social fragmentation. Addressing any one of these problems in isolation might have been feasible. Addressing all of them simultaneously, while the economic base that funded public works was contracting, may have been simply impossible. There is a modern analogy that illuminates this dynamic. Complex organizations today sometimes face what management theorists call a doom loop, a situation in which multiple interacting problems reinforce each other faster than the organization can address them. Each attempted fix consumes resources that are needed for other problems. Each unsolved problem generates new problems. The organization falls further and further behind, its capacity to respond shrinking, even as the demands on that capacity grow. The Harappan civilization, facing a multidimensional environmental crisis with limited institutional resources, may have entered exactly this kind of doom loop, a spiral of compounding problems and diminishing capacity that ended only when the system itself dissolved. The evidence from the later phases of Harappan occupation is consistent with this interpretation. At site after site, the later levels show the same pattern: declining construction quality, deteriorating infrastructure, encroachment on public spaces, fragmentation of standardized practices. These are the archaeological signatures of a society losing its ability to maintain the systems that sustain it, not because the people were less skilled or less intelligent than their predecessors, but because the resources, the coordination, and the social cohesion required to maintain those systems were being consumed by the crisis faster than they could be replenished. The environmental changes that drove the Harappan decline were not limited to water scarcity. Recent research has identified additional stresses that would have compounded the effects of drought and river failure. Studies of ancient soils from the Indus floodplain suggest that salinization, the accumulation of salt in agricultural soils due to irrigation practices, may have reduced crop yields in some areas long before the monsoon weakened. Irrigation, especially in arid environments, can lead to salt buildup as water evaporates and leaves dissolved minerals behind. Over centuries, this process can render once fertile land unproductive. The Harappans, who depended heavily on irrigated agriculture, may have been degrading their own agricultural base through the very practices that sustained them, creating a slow-burning crisis that was then accelerated by the monsoon shift. Deforestation is another factor that has received attention from researchers. Dense urban populations require fuel for cooking, for firing bricks, for smelting metals, and for craft production. The forests of the Indus floodplain and surrounding hills would have been under continuous pressure from harvesting. As forest cover declined, the effects would have cascaded. Increased soil erosion, reduced groundwater recharge, altered local rainfall patterns, and the loss of timber for construction. The parallel with the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon, who deforested their surroundings to build their great houses, is instructive. In both cases, the environmental cost of the civilization's own success contributed to the conditions that eventually made that success unsustainable. There is also the question of disease. While there is no direct evidence of a devastating epidemic, the conditions of the late Harappan period, overcrowding in declining cities, deteriorating sanitation, contaminated water supplies, malnutrition from crop failures, would have created an environment conducive to the spread of waterborne and vector-borne diseases. Skeletal evidence from late-phase Mohenjo-Daro includes individuals showing signs of chronic illness, anemia, and malnutrition. The population was under physiological stress, its resistance to disease compromised by poor nutrition and worsening living conditions. The convergence of these multiple factors, drought, river failure, monsoon volatility, soil salinization, deforestation, potential disease, and institutional weakness, created what modern systems theorists would call a perfect storm of interacting stresses. No single factor was necessarily fatal on its own, but their simultaneous occurrence overwhelmed the capacity of the Harappan social system to respond. The civilization died not of a single wound but of 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to survive individually, but devastating in combination. Something is wrong with our assumptions about civilizational resilience. We believe sophisticated societies adapt. The Harappan case suggests that when environmental changes are severe enough, when they affect multiple systems simultaneously, when governance structures are not designed for crisis management, the most rational response may be departure. People leave, they start over, and they lose everything except their lives. The material evidence of decline is visible in every later stratum. In the final phases at Mohenjo-Daro, standardized bricks give way to irregular stones and recycled rubble. Drains clog and collapse. Streets are blocked by squatter shelters. Grand houses are partitioned into tiny rooms. The craft traditions decline sharply. What remains is a shadow. And then eventually even the shadow departs. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The forces that dissolved the Harappan civilization are not unique to the ancient past. They operate today. Shifting rivers, changing rainfall, compound environmental crises, institutional inability to respond. The Harappan disappearance is not just an ancient story, it is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is deeply uncomfortable. The pattern of settlement abandonment provides additional evidence for the environmental interpretation. The earliest sites to be abandoned were those in the eastern regions along the Gagahakra, where the river's failure would have been felt first and most acutely. Sites in this region show progressive thinning of population, with smaller and smaller communities occupying what had once been substantial towns, before final abandonment. In the Indus floodplain, the pattern was different. suggesting a more chaotic decline driven by alternating flood and drought. In Gujarat, some sites actually grew during the early stages of the collapse, as displaced populations from the Gagahakra region migrated southward before eventually contracting as conditions worsened across the entire civilization. The coastal city of Dhalavira, with its rock-cut reservoirs designed to capture monsoon rainfall, appears to have survived longer than most inland cities. Its water management system provided a buffer against declining rainfall that other settlements lacked. But even Dhalavira's reservoirs could not compensate indefinitely for a weakening monsoon, and the city was eventually abandoned as well, its great signboard left standing above an empty gateway, addressed to visitors who would not come for 4,000 years. The pattern of decline, spreading from east to west and from inland to coast, following the geography of water stress rather than the routes of any invading army, provides some of the strongest evidence that environmental factors rather than invasion were the primary drivers of the collapse. An invading army would have pushed in from the northwest, the direction of Central Asia. A plague would have spread along trade routes. Only environmental degradation accounts for the observed pattern. Earliest abandonment in the regions most dependent on the failing Gagahakra, later abandonment along the Indus, and latest abandonment in the coastal areas of Gujarat. The decline also manifested in the fragmentation of the standardized systems that had defined the mature Harappan period. The uniform brick ratio, maintained for centuries across an area of 1.3 million square kilometers, broke down as regional variations appeared. The precise weight system lost its accuracy. Pottery styles diverged from the once uniform Harappan tradition, with new forms appearing that had no precedent in the mature Harappan repertoire. It was as if the invisible threads of shared convention that had held the civilization together were snapping one by one, each break weakening the remaining connections until the entire fabric came apart. The ceramic evidence is particularly telling because pottery is one of the most sensitive indicators of cultural continuity and change in the archaeological record. During the mature Harappan period, pottery was produced in consistent forms, using consistent techniques across the entire civilization. The transition to the late Harappan period saw a marked simplification of pottery forms, a decline in painted decoration, and the emergence of regional styles that differed significantly from one area to another. This transition was not abrupt. It was gradual, unfolding over several generations, which argues against sudden catastrophe and in favor of a slow, grinding process of cultural dissolution under environmental pressure. There is one more factor that deserves attention: the psychological dimension of slow-onset crisis. When systems fail gradually, the people living within them do not always recognize what is happening. Each generation inherits a world slightly worse than the one their parents knew, but since they have no direct experience of better times, the decline seems normal. This phenomenon, known in ecology as shifting baseline syndrome, almost certainly operated during the Harappan decline. The generation that lived with seasonal rivers had no memory of perennial ones. The generation that inhabited decaying cities had no memory of pristine ones. Each generation normalized its own diminished reality and adapted to it, never fully comprehending the magnitude of the loss, because it had accumulated gradually across lifetimes. This gradual normalization may explain why the Harappan people did not undertake dramatic adaptive measures. They did not build great new canals or reservoirs. They did not reorganize their settlement patterns in a coordinated way. They simply adjusted, year by year, generation by generation, to a world slowly becoming less hospitable. By the time the decline was severe enough to be unmistakable, the resources and social cohesion needed for a dramatic response may have been gone. The window for action had closed, while the people were still debating whether there was a problem at all. The relationship between environmental change and social disintegration at Harappan sites reveals a pattern that is both instructive and deeply sobering. The decline did not happen everywhere at the same time or in the same way. It was a rolling collapse, moving across the civilization in waves that followed the geography of environmental stress. Understanding this spatial and temporal pattern is essential to grasping the full complexity of the Harappan disappearance. In the Gagahakra region, which was the first to feel the impact of the drying river, the decline began earliest. Sites in this area, including Kalibangan, one of the most important Harappan settlements in Rajasthan, show evidence of abandonment during the early stages of the crisis. Kalibangan had been a substantial town with a citadel, a lower town, and extensive craft production facilities. Its abandonment removed one node from the trade network, reducing the connectivity of the system as a whole. As more sites in the Gagahakra region were abandoned, the network thinned, and the remaining nodes, including the great cities, lost trading partners, suppliers, and markets. The cascading effect of network thinning is a well-documented phenomenon in complex systems. When a network loses nodes, the remaining nodes must compensate by increasing their own connections or by finding new partners. If the losses continue, the network reaches a tipping point beyond which the remaining connections cannot sustain the system, and the network collapses rapidly. This is the phenomenon known as percolation failure, and it may explain why the Harappan decline, which began gradually, appeared to accelerate in its later phases. The initial losses were absorbable, the later losses were not. The system crossed a threshold and entered a phase of rapid, irreversible decline. The trade with Mesopotamia provides a measurable proxy for this network collapse. Harappan seals and other artifacts found at Mesopotamian sites become progressively rarer after approximately 2000 before the Common Era. References to Meluha in Mesopotamian cuneiform texts, which had been frequent during the height of Harappan prosperity, diminish and eventually disappear. The international trade that brought wealth, raw materials, and prestige to the Harappan world was severed, and with it went the economic surplus that had supported urban specialization, craft production, and the maintenance of civic infrastructure. The loss of external trade would have had internal consequences as well. The Harappan weight system, which was maintained across the entire civilization with extraordinary precision, was fundamentally a tool of commerce. Its uniformity served the needs of merchants who traded across vast distances and needed confidence that a weight in one city meant the same thing as a weight in another. When trade declined, the need for standardized weights declined with it. The weights did not disappear overnight, but the economic pressure that had maintained their precision, the collective self-interest of a trading community in honest measurement, weakened as the trading community itself contracted. Standards are maintained by the communities that use them. When the community disperses, the standards dissolve. The same logic applies to every other standardized element of Harappan culture. The uniform brick ratio was maintained because builders across the civilization shared a common tradition and perhaps a common regulatory framework. When the civilization fragmented into isolated regional communities, the incentive to maintain a civilization-wide standard disappeared. Each community began making bricks to its own specifications, and the uniformity that had defined Harappan identity was lost. The script, whatever it recorded, was maintained because it served some communicative purpose within the civilization's institutional framework. When those institutions dissolved, the script lost its function and was abandoned. Within a generation or two, no one could read it. Within a few more generations, no one remembered that it had ever existed. This pattern of standard dissolution following community dispersal is not unique to the Harappan case. It has been observed in the aftermath of every major civilizational collapse. The standardized Latin script that unified the Roman Empire fragmented into regional vernaculars after Rome's fall. The standardized administrative practices of the Chinese Han Dynasty dissolved during the period of fragmentation that followed its collapse. In each case, the standards survived only as long as the community that maintained them remained intact. The Harappan case is distinguished by the completeness of the dissolution, not a gradual evolution of standards into new forms, but a total abandonment, followed by total forgetting. The archaeological site of Perak in Balochistan provides a fascinating glimpse into the post-Harappan transition. Occupied from roughly 1800 to 500 before the Common Era, Perak shows a community that adopted some Harappan practices while developing new ones of its own. The pottery is different from the mature Harappan tradition. The architecture lacks the grid planning and standardized bricks of the earlier period, but certain continuities can be detected. The cultivation of wheat and barley, the use of some Harappan-style craft techniques, the occupation of the same general region. Perak represents the reorganization phase of the adaptive cycle, the emergence of new cultural forms from the fragments of the old. It is a living example of what happens after a civilization dissolves. Not nothing, but something different, something simpler, something that has lost the accumulated sophistication of what came before. The Harappan disappearance does not stand alone in history. It belongs to a broader pattern of civilizational collapse that has repeated itself across cultures, continents, and millennia. To understand what happened along the Indus and the Gagar Hakra, we must examine this pattern and test the Harappan case against the experiences of other civilizations that rose to great heights and then fell. Each comparison illuminates a different facet of the puzzle. Each reveals something about why complex societies fail, and each, in its own way, deepens the mystery of why the Harappan collapse took the particular form it did: quiet, gradual, and almost entirely non-violent. The first comparison that illuminates the Harappan disappearance is the late Bronze Age collapse, which struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 before the Common Era. Within a span of roughly 50 years, the entire interconnected world of the eastern Mediterranean was torn apart. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia and northern Syria for centuries, collapsed and never recovered. Mycenaean Greece fell into a dark age lasting 4 centuries, during which literacy was lost and populations plummeted. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was burned and abandoned, its final correspondence including desperate pleas for military assistance and grain shipments that never arrived. Egypt survived, but barely, and entered a long period of diminished power and reduced territory. The collapse was systemic. It was not caused by a single invader or a single disaster, but by the simultaneous failure of multiple interconnected systems. A severe drought, documented in pollen records from the Levant, reduced agricultural production across the region. Famine destabilized political systems that depended on surplus grain to fund armies and bureaucracies. Disrupted trade cut off access to essential materials, particularly tin, which had to be imported from distant sources and was essential for making bronze. The Sea Peoples, possibly themselves refugees from drought-stricken homelands, attacked weakened states that could no longer defend themselves. Each failure amplified the others. Trade depended on stable states. States depended on surplus agriculture. Agriculture depended on reliable climate. When the climate shifted, the entire system unraveled. Eric Klein of George Washington University has described the late Bronze Age collapse as a classic case of systems failure, in which the tight interconnection of multiple systems meant that the failure of any one triggered cascading failures in all the others. The parallels with the Harappan case are unmistakable. Both civilizations were interconnected networks dependent on trade, agriculture, and maintained infrastructure. Both were overwhelmed by a combination of environmental stress and institutional inadequacy. Both resulted not in conquest by a new power, but in the dissolution of an existing system into smaller, simpler, more isolated units. The complex system broke apart because its components could no longer sustain each other. But there is a crucial difference between the late Bronze Age collapse and the Harappan disappearance. The Bronze Age collapse was violent. Cities were burned, populations were massacred. Military conflict was a prominent feature of the disintegration. The Harappan disappearance, by contrast, appears to have been largely peaceful. No burned cities, no mass graves, no evidence of invading armies or desperate military defense. The people left. They were not driven out. This peacefulness is one of the most distinctive and puzzling features of the Harappan case, and no comparison with other collapses fully explains it. The second comparison takes us across the Atlantic to the American Southwest and the ancestral Puebloans. Between roughly 850 and 1300 of the Common Era, the ancestral Puebloans built some of the most remarkable structures in pre-Columbian North America. At Chaco Canyon, in what is now New Mexico, they constructed great houses of stone and timber some containing over 600 rooms. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of these, rose 4 stories high. The road network connecting Chaco to outlying communities was extensive, with roads up to 9 meters wide, stretching for distances of over 60 kilometers. The astronomy was sophisticated, with buildings aligned to mark solstices and equinoxes. Around 1150, Chaco was abandoned. The population shifted north to Mesa Verde, where they built the famous cliff dwellings, for roughly a century before abandoning those as well. By 1300, the entire Four Corners region was depopulated. Tree ring data provides an extraordinarily precise record of what happened. The Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 was one of the worst dry periods the region had experienced in centuries. But drought alone does not explain the abandonment. The Puebloans had survived earlier droughts. Environmental degradation had reduced the region's capacity to absorb the shock. The math is striking. Pueblo Bonito alone required an estimated 215,000 timber beams, hauled on human backs from forests over 75 kilometers away. The forests surrounding Chaco Canyon were depleted. Soil erosion followed deforestation. Groundwater levels dropped. When the Great Drought arrived, the environmental buffer that forest cover and soil moisture had previously provided was gone. The Puebloans had pushed their environment to its limits during good times and had no margin left when bad times came. The parallel to the Harappan case is clear. Environmental stress, amplified by human degradation of the landscape, overwhelmed the capacity of a complex society to adapt. The third comparison is the Khmer Empire of Southeast Asia. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the Khmer built the largest pre-industrial city in the world at Angkor, covering roughly 1,000 square kilometers. Modern LiDAR surveys have revealed the full extent of what was hidden beneath the jungle canopy, an urban landscape of staggering scale and sophistication. The Khmer were master hydraulic engineers. Their system of vast reservoirs, called barries, the largest measuring roughly 8 kilometers by 2.1 kilometers, and intricate canal networks captured monsoon rainfall and distributed it across the agricultural landscape, sustaining intensive rice cultivation that fed perhaps 1 million people. Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century, is the largest religious monument ever constructed. The engineering required millions of sandstone blocks, quarried from mountains over 50 kilometers away and transported by canal. The achievement was breathtaking, and yet, by the mid-15th century, Angkor was abandoned. Research by Brendan Buckley, using tree ring records from Vietnam, and by Roland Fletcher at the University of Sydney, has revealed that alternating severe droughts and extreme monsoon floods during the 14th and 15th centuries overwhelmed the water management system. The infrastructure that had been designed for average conditions could not handle the extremes. During droughts, the reservoirs emptied. During floods, the canal network was damaged by erosion and sedimentation. As the infrastructure failed, agricultural production collapsed. The population could no longer be sustained. The Khmer case illuminates a dynamic that almost certainly operated in the Harappan world. The failure of infrastructure maintenance during environmental crisis. Complex hydraulic systems require constant upkeep. Canals silt up, reservoirs accumulate sediment, dikes erode. Without continuous investment of labor and resources, the infrastructure degrades, and the resources for maintenance come from the agricultural surplus that the infrastructure itself produces. When climate stress reduces that surplus, maintenance declines, infrastructure deteriorates, production falls further, and a downward spiral begins. This spiral, once established, is extremely difficult to reverse. The Harappan drainage systems, which required regular cleaning, inspection, and repair, would have been subject to exactly this dynamic. As the city's economic base weakened, the drains that kept the cities livable would have been among the first casualties. The comparison between the Khmer and Harappan hydraulic systems deserves further examination because it illuminates the central role of water management in both civilizations and in their respective collapses. Both the Khmer and the Harappans were master hydraulic engineers. Both built their prosperity on the ability to capture, store, and distribute water across large areas. Both created urban centers that could sustain populations far larger than the natural water supply would have permitted without engineering intervention, and both were ultimately undone by changes in the water regime that their engineered systems could not accommodate. The critical difference is that the Khmer water management system was centralized and monumental, with vast reservoirs and canals that required massive coordinated labor. The Harappan water management system was distributed, with hundreds of individual wells, household drainage connections, and neighborhood-level infrastructure. This distributed character may have been an advantage during the early stages of decline, allowing individual communities to maintain their own infrastructure even as the larger system weakened. But it became a disadvantage as the decline deepened, because there was no centralized authority capable of mobilizing the large-scale response that the crisis ultimately required. The contrast between Angkor and Mohenjo-Daro also illustrates important differences in archaeological visibility. Angkor's stone temples, despite being consumed by jungle, were never completely forgotten. Local Khmer populations knew of the ruins and visited them for religious purposes. The temples were too massive, too prominent to disappear from awareness entirely. Mohenjo-Daro, built of brick rather than stone, lacked this monumental presence. Once buried beneath river sediment, it became invisible, and invisible ruins are forgotten ruins. The material from which a civilization builds determines not only how long its structures survive, but whether anyone remembers they existed at all. The fourth comparison is Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, located near present-day St. Louis. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 of the Common Era, Cahokia and its surrounding communities housed perhaps 50,000 people. Monk's Mound, the central platform, is the largest earthwork in the Americas, covering over 5.5 hectares and rising 30 meters above the floodplain. The city had specialized crafts, long-distance trade networks reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, astronomical observatories, and a social hierarchy that included human sacrifice. By 1300, Cahokia was abandoned and its people dispersed. The causes were familiar. Deforestation of surrounding uplands leading to erosion and sedimentation, increased flooding possibly linked to climatic shifts, social stress and political instability, visible in the construction of defensive palisades, and increasing evidence of violence in later burials. The compound nature of the crisis, environmental degradation combined with social fragmentation, mirrors the Harappan pattern. The fifth comparison is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where hunter-gatherers built monumental stone structures roughly 11,500 years ago, then deliberately buried the entire site. The burial was systematic and intentional. No invasion, no catastrophe, no evidence of violence. Just a decision, made for reasons we cannot recover, to bury the past and move on. The parallel to the Harappan case lies not in the cause but in the manner, deliberate, non-violent, and unexplained. Across all 5 comparisons, a pattern emerges. Complex civilizations are built on environmental and social foundations. When those foundations shift, the civilization enters a crisis. The specific causes vary: drought, river change, resource depletion, institutional failure, external attack. The specific outcomes vary: violent collapse, gradual dissolution, deliberate abandonment. But the underlying dynamic is consistent. The mismatch between a society's needs and its environment's capacity to meet those needs produces a crisis that the society's institutions cannot manage. What makes the Harappan case unique is the combination of several features. First, the scale. This was one of the largest civilizations of the ancient world, not a city-state or a small kingdom. Second, the apparent peacefulness. There is almost no evidence of violence associated with the collapse. Third, the completeness of the forgetting. Unlike the ancestral Puebloans, who preserved oral traditions of their migration, or the Khmer, who retained memory of Angkor, the Harappans were forgotten absolutely. And fourth, the silence. The undeciphered script means we have no access to the Harappan perspective on their own disappearance. This silence is perhaps the most important distinguishing feature. Every other collapsed civilization in our comparison left behind some record, either their own or someone else's, of what happened. The Bronze Age civilizations left behind archives of clay tablets. The ancestral Puebloans left behind oral traditions. The Khmer left behind stone inscriptions. Even the Sea Peoples are known from Egyptian records. The Harappans left behind only bricks and bones, and the enigmatic symbols of a script no one can read. Some scholars have proposed an interpretation of the Harappan disappearance that reframes it not as a failure, but as a choice. Perhaps the Harappan people, faced with failing rivers and an unpredictable monsoon, made a collective, pragmatic, generation-by-generation decision to leave their cities. Perhaps as a society without a warrior elite, without kings invested in holding territory at all costs, was actually more willing to disperse peacefully than a hierarchical society would have been. If no one was fighting to maintain power, no one needed to fight. People assessed their situation, recognized that urban life was no longer viable, and left. This interpretation is speculative, but carries a certain logic. The Harappan people did not die in their cities, they survived. Genetic evidence confirms that the populations dispersed rather than perished. Their descendants are among the ancestors of modern South Asian populations. The civilization ended. The people did not. They carried their genes, their basic agricultural knowledge, and perhaps fragments of their cultural practices into new communities in the Ganges Plain, in Gujarat, in central India. But survival came at a devastating cost. The engineering skills that built the drains were lost. The standardized weight system dissolved. The writing system was abandoned. The craft traditions declined and disappeared. The accumulated urban knowledge of 28 generations was scattered in less than 8. Knowledge does not survive dispersal. Consider the specific knowledge that was lost with the Harappan civilization. The technique of firing bricks to a precise hardness using controlled kiln temperatures, a skill that required years of experience and intimate knowledge of local clay types, firing conditions, and fuel management. The method of surveying terrain and laying out a grid-planned city without modern instruments, using only rope, stakes, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders. The art of grading drainage channels to achieve the correct slope for gravity-fed flow, a calculation that requires understanding of fluid dynamics in a practical, hands-on sense, even if the theoretical principles are not articulated. The technique of sealing a pool or a drain with natural bitumen to achieve waterproof construction, which requires knowledge of where to source the bitumen, how to prepare it, what temperature to apply it, and how thick a layer is needed for different applications. The art of cutting and polishing carnelian to produce beads of extraordinary precision and beauty, a process involving careful stone selection, controlled heating, grinding with specialized tools, and drilling with slender copper or bronze drills using abrasive compounds. Each of these skills represents centuries of accumulated experimentation, trial, error, and refinement. Each was carried by specific practitioners who transmitted their knowledge through hands-on apprenticeship. Each was embedded in institutional frameworks that maintained quality standards and provided markets for the products. When the institutions dissolved and the practitioners dispersed, each skill died independently. Its practitioners scattered to communities where the skill was neither needed nor valued. The loss was not a single event, but 1,000 separate extinctions, each one removing a thread from the tapestry of Harappan knowledge until the tapestry itself ceased to exist. The weight system provides a particularly poignant example. The Harappan weights were among the most precise measuring instruments in the ancient world. Their accuracy implies the existence of master weight makers who could cut and polish stone cubes to exact specifications and of quality control systems that verified the accuracy of each weight against a reference standard. This was not casual craftsmanship. This was precision manufacturing, maintained across a subcontinental area for 7 centuries. When the trade that required precise weights declined, the need for precision declined with it. The master weight makers retired or died without training successors. The reference standards were lost or discarded. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to produce weights to such precision was gone, not destroyed, simply no longer needed, and therefore no longer practiced, and therefore no longer known. It requires communities of practice, institutional frameworks, ongoing need. When the communities dispersed, the need disappeared and the knowledge followed. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The loss of knowledge is the true catastrophe of the Harappan disappearance. Not the emptying of cities, which are just arrangements of bricks. Not the collapse of institutions, which are just patterns of behavior. The loss of what was known. Skills that took centuries to develop were lost in a generation because the conditions that required them no longer existed. The world became measurably poorer when the last Harappan engineer forgot how to grade a drain, when the last seal carver put down his tools, when the last person who could read the Indus script died without passing that knowledge to another. The comparison with the Maya civilization of Mesoamerica adds yet another dimension. Between roughly 250 and 900 of the Common Era, the Maya built one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. They developed a fully phonetic writing system, an advanced calendar, and astronomical observations of extraordinary precision. Their cities, including Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul, and Copan, were centers of art, learning, and political power. And then, between roughly 800 and 1000 of the Common Era, the cities of the southern Maya lowlands were abandoned in what scholars call the classic Maya collapse. The causes were multiple and interacting. Severe drought, documented in cave stalagmite records and lake sediment cores, combined with deforestation, soil exhaustion, and endemic warfare among competing city-states. The population of the southern lowlands may have declined by 90% within 2 centuries. The great cities were swallowed by the jungle. The writing system, which had been used primarily by the elite, was eventually lost. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Maya of the Yucatan still remembered their ancestors had been great builders and scholars, but the specific knowledge of the classic period had been largely forgotten. The Maya comparison is instructive for several reasons. First, the Maya collapse demonstrates that environmental degradation, particularly deforestation and soil exhaustion, can amplify the impact of climate change to catastrophic effect. The Harappan world may have experienced similar environmental degradation, though the evidence is less clear. Second, the Maya collapse was violent, characterized by warfare, political fragmentation, and social upheaval. The Harappan collapse, by contrast, appears to have been peaceful. This difference underscores the uniqueness of the Harappan case and the puzzle of how millions of people could disperse without significant conflict. Third, the Maya case demonstrates that literacy does not guarantee the preservation of knowledge. The Maya had one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas, yet much of what they recorded was lost when the communities that maintained the scribal tradition dispersed. The parallel to the Harappan case is poignant. Even if the Harappan script was a true writing system, even if it recorded histories, laws, and scientific knowledge, those records were lost when the civilization dissolved. Writing does not save knowledge. Communities save knowledge. And when communities break apart, writing becomes unreadable symbols on forgotten artifacts, as mute and meaningless as the Indus seals that sit in museum cases today, their messages permanently sealed. Across all these comparisons, certain principles emerge that apply to the Harappan case and to the phenomenon of civilizational collapse in general. First, complex civilizations are more fragile than they appear. Their complexity is a source of power, but also of vulnerability. The more interconnected the system, the more pathways exist for failure to propagate. Second, environmental change is the most common trigger for collapse, but it is rarely the sole cause. Environmental stress typically interacts with social, economic, and institutional factors to produce a compound crisis that exceeds the capacity of the society to respond. Third, the loss of knowledge that accompanies collapse is typically greater than the loss of population. People survive, knowledge does not. The gap between biological survival and cultural survival is the chasm in which civilizations disappear. The Harappan civilization fell through this chasm more completely than any other great civilization of the ancient world. Its people survived, its genes persist, but its knowledge, its institutions, its writing, its standards, its urban planning principles, its engineering expertise, all of it was lost. Lost not through destruction, but through disuse. Lost because the conditions that required it no longer existed. Lost because knowledge that is not practiced is knowledge that dies. The deeper truth about the Harappan disappearance is a truth about complexity itself and the hidden cost of optimization. Complex systems, whether ecological, technological, or social, share characteristics that make them simultaneously powerful and fragile. They are interconnected, with each component depending on many others. They are efficient, producing maximum output from minimum input under normal conditions. They are specialized, with individual components refined for specific functions, and they are adapted to specific conditions, optimized for a particular environmental and social context. The Harappan civilization embodied all of these traits. Its cities were connected by trade routes spanning a subcontinent. Its economy was efficient, converting irrigated agriculture into large surpluses that supported dense urban populations. Its crafts were specialized, requiring years of apprenticeship, and all of it was adapted to a specific environmental regime: reliable monsoon rainfall, perennial or seasonal rivers, and broad fertile floodplains. When the environmental regime changed, every strength became a vulnerability. The interconnection that had spread prosperity became the channel through which failure propagated. When drought struck the Gagga-Hakra settlements, it was not just those settlements that suffered. The trade networks that connected them to coastal ports were disrupted. The craft workshops that depended on those trade networks lost access to raw materials and markets. The cities that depended on agricultural surplus from the Gagga-Hakra region lost their food supply. Each failure cascaded through the system, amplifying the impact of the initial disruption far beyond its point of origin. The efficiency that had maximized production under stable conditions left no buffer when conditions became unstable. An efficient agricultural system produces exactly as much surplus as it can, given the available water, land, and labor. It does not maintain excess capacity for emergencies. When the monsoon weakened, there was no slack in the system to absorb the shock. Every reduction in rainfall translated directly into a reduction in food production, which translated into a reduction in the economic surplus that supported urban life, which translated into a reduction in the capacity to maintain infrastructure, which translated into further reductions in productivity. The cycle was vicious and self-reinforcing. Let that sink in. The very qualities that made the Harappan civilization great, its efficiency, interconnection, its specialization, were the qualities that made it vulnerable. The civilization was not destroyed by its weaknesses. It was destroyed by the dark side of its strengths. Its optimization for one set of conditions left it catastrophically ill-prepared for another. This is not science fiction. This is a pattern documented in the archaeological record of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. And it has direct, uncomfortable relevance to the modern world. Our global systems are more interconnected, more efficient, more specialized, and more dependent on specific conditions than anything the Harappan world ever built. Our supply chains span the globe. Our food production is optimized for current climate patterns. Our cities are designed for current sea levels, current rainfall, current temperature ranges. If any of these conditions changes significantly, the interconnection that sustains us becomes the pathway through which failure spreads. The Indian summer monsoon, the climate system whose shift contributed to the Harappan dissolution, remains one of the most important climate systems on Earth. More than 1 billion people depend on it today. It governs agricultural production across the entire Indian subcontinent, and it is, according to current scientific research, becoming more variable. The pattern that undermined the Harappan world 4,000 years ago, increased volatility in monsoon rainfall, may be emerging again. The specifics are different. The technologies available for adaptation are vastly more powerful, but the fundamental vulnerability, dependence on a climate system that is assumed to be stable, is the same. Let that sink in. The monsoon is not the only climate system at stake. The global pattern of climate change that affected the Harappan world 4,200 years ago is now understood as a complex, interconnected event involving changes in ocean circulation, atmospheric patterns, and solar activity. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not confined to South Asia. It affected civilizations worldwide. This global character suggests that the forces driving the Harappan decline were beyond the control of any human society, no matter how well organized. The monsoon shift was a natural climatic fluctuation of the kind that has occurred repeatedly throughout Earth history. The Harappans happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, dependent on a climate system about to change in ways no one could have predicted or prevented. This raises a philosophical question of considerable weight. If the Harappan collapse was caused primarily by natural forces beyond human control, does it carry lessons for modern societies facing climate change driven by human activity? The situations are not identical. Modern climate change is anthropogenic and therefore, in principle, subject to mitigation. The monsoon shift that affected the Harappans was natural, but the vulnerability is the same. Both the Harappan world and the modern world built prosperity on the assumption that specific climate conditions would persist. Both face the risk that those conditions will change, and both face the question of whether their institutions can respond quickly enough to prevent collapse. The Harappan answer was no. Their institutions proved unable to coordinate the rapid adaptation the crisis required. The cities emptied. The knowledge was lost. The civilization dissolved. The modern world has tools the Harappans lacked: predictive science, advanced engineering, global communication, and the collective knowledge of 4,000 additional years of experience. Whether these tools will prove sufficient remains to be seen. But the Harappan case stands as a reminder that sophistication alone does not guarantee survival, and that the gap between what a civilization knows and what it does with that knowledge can be the difference between adaptation and dissolution. There is a concept from ecology that helps frame the Harappan experience. Ecologists distinguish between resistance and resilience. A resistant system maintains its current state in the face of disturbance. A resilient system may change in response to disturbance, but retains the capacity to reorganize and recover its essential functions. The Harappan civilization was resistant. It maintained an instance and infrastructure for 7 centuries, despite periodic floods, occasional droughts, and the ongoing challenge of managing a vast, dispersed population. But it was not resilient. When the cumulative disturbances exceeded the threshold of resistance, the system did not reorganize. It collapsed. The standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the integrated drainage, all represented optimization for a specific set of conditions. When those conditions changed, the optimized system had no flexibility, no reserve capacity, no ability to transform into something new while retaining its core functions. It was built for permanence in a world that, as it turned out, was impermanent. The Harappan disappearance also reveals a profound truth about the relationship between knowledge and context. Knowledge does not exist in the abstract. It exists in practice, in the daily doing of skilled work, within a community that needs and values that work. The Harappan engineer who knew how to grade a drainage channel possessed that knowledge only because she practiced it regularly. Within a city that needed drains, surrounded by colleagues who shared her standards and her expertise, supported by institutions that trained new practitioners and maintained quality. Remove any element of this context, the community, the need, the institutions, and the knowledge withers. When the Harappan cities were abandoned, every element of this context was destroyed simultaneously. The drain layers moved to villages that did not need drains. The brickmakers moved to communities that built with mud. The seal carvers found themselves in settlements where the writing system served no purpose. Each specialist, isolated from the context that sustained their skill, lost that skill within a generation. The knowledge that had built the most livable cities in the ancient world was not destroyed by any catastrophe. It was simply rendered useless by a change in circumstances, and then forgotten because no one needed it anymore. This has implications for how we think about knowledge preservation. We tend to assume that knowledge, once created, is permanent, that it can be written down, stored, and retrieved whenever needed. But the Harappan case reveals that practical knowledge, the knowledge of how to do things, is fundamentally different from theoretical knowledge. Practical knowledge is embodied in practitioners. It is transmitted through apprenticeship, through doing, through the intimate process of learning from someone who already knows. It cannot be fully captured in any written form. And when the chain of apprenticeship is broken, when the last practitioner stops practicing, the knowledge is gone forever. The deeper truth is this. The Harappan civilization was dissolved by the interaction of multiple forces acting simultaneously on a complex system that was powerful but brittle. Rivers shifted, monsoons weakened, trade networks frayed, institutions failed, and the knowledge that had sustained the civilization was dispersed and forgotten, because the conditions that required it no longer existed. The people survived, the knowledge did not. The adaptive cycle model helps explain one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the Harappan collapse: why the most successful and most sophisticated civilization in the region was also the most vulnerable. In the conservation phase of the adaptive cycle, a system reaches peak efficiency and interconnection. But this peak state is also the state of maximum rigidity and maximum vulnerability to disruption. The system has been optimized for current conditions. It has accumulated structure. It has invested in specific configurations that work well under those conditions. Any change in conditions threatens to invalidate the entire investment. The mature Harappan civilization, at its peak, was the most structured, most standardized, most interconnected version of itself. It was also the version most vulnerable to the environmental shift that was about to occur. Simpler, less optimized societies are often more resilient, precisely because they have less to lose. A small farming village dependent on local rainfall and local resources can survive a drought by reducing its population, shifting its crop mix, or moving a few kilometers to a better water source. A large city dependent on long-distance trade, centralized food supply, and maintained infrastructure cannot make these adjustments. Its complexity is its prison. The more sophisticated the system, the more ways it can fail, and the harder it is to recover from failure. This is the paradox of complexity. The very achievements that make a civilization great are the achievements that make it fragile. And the gap between survival and the preservation of civilizational knowledge is the chasm in which the Harappan civilization disappeared. There is another dimension to the deeper truth that connects the Harappan experience to universal principles of complex systems. The Canadian ecologist C.S. Holling described what he called the adaptive cycle, a pattern in which complex systems pass through recurring phases of growth, conservation, release, and reorganization. In the growth phase, the system exploits available resources and expands. In the conservation phase, it becomes increasingly efficient, interconnected, and rigid. In the release phase, some disruption triggers a rapid breakdown. In the reorganization phase, the remnants recombine into something new. The Harappan civilization maps onto this cycle with eerie precision. The early Harappan period was the growth phase, with farming communities expanding, trade networks forming, and cultural practices converging. The mature Harappan period was the conservation phase, with the civilization reaching peak efficiency and interconnection, its standards uniform, its trade networks extensive, its cities functioning like a well-tuned machine. The collapse was the release phase, triggered by the shift in environmental conditions that the system could not absorb. And the post-Harappan period, with its smaller, simpler, more diverse communities, was the reorganization phase, from which new cultural forms eventually emerged. If this model is correct, then the Harappan collapse was not an anomaly. It was a phase in a cycle that all complex systems undergo. The question is not whether a civilization will face its release phase, but when and how it will navigate the passage. The Harappan people navigated their release phase by dispersal, moving from large cities to small villages, from specialized urban life to generalized rural life, from complexity to simplicity. It was a loss, but it was also survival. And from the simplified communities that emerged, new complexity eventually grew, though it took centuries and took forms that bore little resemblance to what had come before. The concept of resilience, as used in ecology and complex systems theory, helps explain why the Harappan civilization could not sustain itself through the environmental crisis. Resilience is not the same as stability. A stable system resists change and returns to its previous state after disturbance. A resilient system absorbs disturbance and reorganizes while retaining its essential function. The Harappan civilization was stable. It maintained its standards and its infrastructure for centuries, but it was not resilient. When the disturbance came, it could not reorganize. It could only break apart. The standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the integrated drainage systems, all of these represented optimization for specific conditions. When those conditions changed, the optimized system had no flexibility, no adaptive capacity, no way to reorganize around a new set of conditions. It was a system designed for permanence that encountered impermanence, and it shattered. This is perhaps the most profound lesson the Harappan disappearance can offer to the modern world. How systems are optimized, how supply chains are efficient, how cities are designed for current conditions. But efficiency and optimization come at the cost of resilience. The more perfectly a system is adapted to one set of conditions, the more catastrophically it fails when those conditions change. The Harappan engineers built the perfect city for a world of reliable monsoon rainfall and perennial rivers. When the rainfall became unreliable and the rivers dried up, their perfection became their prison. They had built a city that worked flawlessly in a world that no longer existed. There is a question that the Harappan disappearance poses to anyone who studies it, a question that reaches beyond the boundaries of archaeology into the foundations of how we think about human achievement. If one of the largest, most sophisticated, and most apparently successful civilizations of the ancient world could dissolve, leaving behind no readable record and passing out of human memory for nearly 4,000 years, what does this tell us about the durability of anything we build? We tend to think of our achievements as permanent. We build cities and expect them to endure. We create institutions and assume they will persist. We accumulate knowledge and believe it will be preserved. The Harappan disappearance challenges every one of these assumptions. A civilization that endured for 700 years, that traded across half the ancient world, that built the most advanced urban sanitation of its era, was forgotten so completely that the modern world did not know it had existed until a century ago. If that can happen to them, the question of whether it can happen to us is not merely academic. Consider how many other civilizations may have been lost in similar ways. The Harappan civilization was one of the three largest civilizations of the Bronze Age world. It occupied an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It sustained millions of people, and it was completely forgotten. If a civilization of that scale can vanish from human memory, what else has been lost? How many chapters of the human story have been erased by time? The Harappan civilization was recovered only because its ruins happened to be found. How many other civilizations lie buried, undiscovered and unremembered, beneath the deserts, the jungles, the seabeds of the world? The implications for the present are uncomfortable but necessary. We live in an age of unprecedented information technology. We record everything. We digitize everything. We assume our records are permanent. But the permanence of records depends on the continuity of the systems that maintain them. Digital archives require hardware, software, energy, and institutions to sustain them. If any of these fail, even temporarily, the records they protect become inaccessible. The assumption of permanence is itself an assumption, and the Harappan case shows what can happen when assumptions prove wrong. There is also a moral dimension to the Harappan story. The civilization appears to have been oriented toward collective welfare rather than individual glory. Its infrastructure served all residents. Its cities were planned for function rather than display. Its most impressive engineering was devoted to sanitation and water supply. If this reading of the evidence is correct, then the world lost not just a civilization, but a particular vision of what civilization can be. A vision centered on equity, public health, and the well-being of ordinary people rather than on military power and royal display. The Harappan disappearance also raises questions about the role of collective memory in sustaining civilizations. A civilization is not just its buildings and its infrastructure, it is its stories, its shared narratives about who it is, where it came from, and what it stands for. These narratives bind communities together, motivate collective action, and provide the framework of meaning within which individual lives are lived. When the Harappan civilization dispersed, these shared narratives dispersed with it. The stories that had been told around hearth fires in Mohenjo-daro were no longer told in the small villages of the Ganges plain. The traditions that had motivated the maintenance of civic infrastructure were no longer relevant in communities that had no civic infrastructure to maintain. The collective memory that had sustained the civilization's identity was dissolved, one family at a time, one generation at a time, until nothing remained but the bricks. This dissolution of collective memory is perhaps the most final form of civilizational death. Buildings can be rebuilt, institutions can be re-established, trade networks can be reconnected. But once the stories are lost, once the shared understanding of who we are and what we value is gone, the civilization itself is gone, even if its people survive. The Harappan people survived their civilization. But their civilization did not survive the loss of its collective memory. And without that memory, the achievements of 7 centuries were reduced to anonymous ruins beneath the dust, waiting 4,000 years for strangers to dig them up and puzzle over what they meant. That vision survives only in the archaeological record, in the standardized bricks and the covered drains and the wells that served every neighborhood. And even that record is now under threat. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro are being destroyed by rising salt, carried by groundwater into the ancient brickwork, where it crystallizes and crumbles the walls from within. The UNESCO World Heritage designation has not halted the damage. Every year, more of the physical evidence of the Harappan achievement is lost. The civilization that was forgotten for 4,000 years is now, in a different way, being forgotten again. The Harappan disappearance forces us to confront the impermanence of everything we build, everything we know, everything we are, not as a counsel of despair, but as a counsel of humility and vigilance. The knowledge we take for granted is fragile. The institutions we depend on are temporary. The environmental conditions we assume will persist are subject to change. The margin between a thriving civilization and a dissolving one may be thinner than we imagine. The Harappans learned this 4,000 years ago. The question is whether we will learn it in time. The Harappan story also invites us to reconsider what we mean by progress. We tend to measure progress in terms of technology: faster machines, taller buildings, more powerful weapons. By these measures, the modern world is incomparably more advanced than the Indus Valley. But if we measure progress in terms of equity, in terms of the distribution of essential services to all members of a community, then the picture grows complicated. Mohenjo-daro achieved something that many modern cities still struggle with: universal access to basic sanitation. The city did not discriminate by wealth or status in its infrastructure. Every household connected to the drainage system, every neighborhood had wells. The Great Bath served the community, not an elite. By the measure of equitable access to essential services, Mohenjo-daro was, in at least one crucial respect, more advanced than many cities today. This should give us pause. It suggests that technological progress and social progress are independent dimensions. A society can be technologically primitive and socially advanced. A society can possess nuclear weapons and space stations while millions of its citizens lack clean water. The failure to recognize this independence leads to distorted understandings of both the ancient world and the modern one. Consider the modern Indus Valley. The river still flows through Pakistan, sustaining agriculture for more than 300 million people. But the region faces challenges that echo the Harappan experience: water stress, climate variability, soil degradation, and institutional weakness. The glaciers that feed the Indus headwaters are changing. The monsoon patterns on which agriculture depends are, according to current scientific research, becoming more variable. The same dynamic that undid the Harappan world 4,000 years ago, dependence on a climate system that was assumed to be stable, persists in the same region today on a vastly larger scale. The Harappan disappearance is not a curiosity of the distant past. It is a case study in the vulnerability of complex societies to environmental change. It is a reminder that civilizations do not last forever, that the margin between thriving and dissolution can be thinner than we imagine, and that the knowledge and institutions we take for granted are maintained only through continuous investment, and continuous vigilance. The Harappans invested in their infrastructure for 7 centuries. When the investment could no longer be sustained, the infrastructure failed and the civilization followed. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable, but that it is possible, and that the cost of complacency can be measured in millennia of lost knowledge and forgotten achievement. There is a final reflection that the Harappan disappearance invites, one that touches on the nature of memory itself. We tend to think of memory as passive, as something that simply persists once created. The Harappan case reveals memory as active, as something that must be continuously maintained through deliberate effort. The Harappan people did not forget their civilization because they chose to forget it. They forgot it because the conditions that sustained the memory, the communities, the institutions, the practices, the shared identity were disrupted. Memory is not stored, it is performed. It is enacted every day in the telling of stories, the practice of skills, the maintenance of traditions. When the performance stops, the memory stops, and once stopped, it cannot easily be restarted. The Harappan civilization has now been remembered for approximately 100 years, since its rediscovery in the 1920s. This is a tiny fraction of the 4,000 years during which it was forgotten. And even now, our memory of the civilization is incomplete, fragmentary, and provisional. We know what the buildings looked like. We do not know who built them or why. We know how the drains functioned. We do not know who maintained them or what authority they served. We know the seals bear symbols. We do not know what those symbols mean. Our memory of the Harappan civilization is a memory of surfaces, of the physical traces that survived burial and time. The depths, the meanings, the human experiences that animated the bricks and drains and seals are beyond recovery. They are the part of the Harappan story that was performed and is now lost, the living memory that died when the last person who remembered it died without passing it on. In the end, the disappearance of the Harappan civilization is a story about the things we take for granted and the speed with which they can be lost. Rivers that flow until they do not. Rains that fall until they do not. Cities that thrive until they do not. Knowledge that seems permanent until it vanishes. The Harappan people did not fail. They responded to a changing world with the tools available to them. When the rivers shifted and the monsoon weakened and the cities became unsustainable, they did what humans have always done when the world changes beneath their feet. They adapted. They moved. They started over. They survived. But in surviving, they lost everything that made their civilization extraordinary. The drains, the bricks, the weights, the writing, the urban knowledge accumulated across 700 years and 28 generations. All of it was shed, like a skin that no longer fit, as the people walked away from their cities and into a simpler, smaller, more uncertain future. The forgetting that followed is the cruelest part. The Harappan civilization was not merely ended, it was erased from human awareness. No epic poem preserved its name. No religious text honored its gods. No neighboring culture recorded the manner of its passing. For nearly 4,000 years, the greatest cities of the Bronze Age world lay buried beneath the dust of the Indus Plain, unknown and unremembered, while later civilizations built their own cities and assumed, as civilizations always assume, that they were the first. Every standardized brick in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro was made by human hands. Every drainage channel was dug by someone who believed the work mattered, who took care with the slope and the seal and the placement of the sump pit. Every carnelian bead was shaped by fingers that belonged to a person with a name we will never know, a family we cannot trace, a story that was never written down. And all of those names, all of those families, all of those small and irreplaceable human lives are gone, not destroyed by violence or erased by conquest, simply unremembered, carried away by the current of time, which spares nothing that is not actively, deliberately, continuously held in memory by the living. The wind moves across the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. It carries particles of ancient brick, worn smooth by 4,500 years of sun and salt and rain. Those particles settle on the surrounding farmland, on the irrigation canals of modern Sindh, on the river that still flows where the ancient river flowed, carrying dust that was once a wall, that was once a floor, That was once part of a city where people lived and worked and bathed and traded and raised their children and grew old and died and were buried and forgotten. The Great Bath holds no water. The drains are choked with salt. The seals wait, patient and undeciphered, inscribed with the words of a people who built one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known, and then departed without leaving a message that anyone alive can read. There is a word in archaeology for the kind of loss that the Harappan disappearance represents. It is called a dark age, a period in which the complexity, literacy, and material sophistication of a previous era are lost, and the communities that follow live in a simpler, poorer, less connected world. The Greek Dark Ages that followed the Mycenaean collapse lasted 4 centuries, during which literacy was lost and population levels plummeted. The European Dark Ages that followed the fall of Rome lasted, by some measures, half a millennium. The Harappan Dark Age, the period between the dissolution of the mature Harappan civilization and the emergence of the later cultures that would eventually produce the Vedic traditions, lasted several centuries as well. During this Dark Age, the urban knowledge of the Harappan world was lost. The grid-planned cities gave way to unplanned villages. The standardized bricks gave way to irregular construction. The covered drains gave way to open gutters, or no drainage at all. The writing system gave way to illiteracy. The civilization that had been the most urban, the most standardized, the most hygienic in the ancient world became, for a time, a collection of scattered agricultural communities with no memory of what had come before. Dark ages are not permanent, they end. New complexity emerges from the ruins of the old, drawing on fragments of the previous tradition and on new influences from outside. The cultures that eventually emerged in the post-Harappan period, the painted greyware culture, the early Vedic communities, the Iron Age kingdoms of the Ganges Plain, were new creations, shaped by new circumstances and new peoples, but they built on a landscape that had been profoundly shaped by the Harappan experience. A landscape of cleared land, established trade routes, and agricultural knowledge that, however diminished, still bore the imprint of the civilization that had come before. The question of continuity between the Harappan world and later South Asian cultures remains one of the most debated topics in the field. Some scholars see strong continuities in religious iconography, particularly in the imagery of a seated figure surrounded by animals on certain Harappan seals, which has been compared to later depictions of the Hindu deity Shiva in his aspect as Pashupati, lord of animals. Others see continuities in the importance of ritual bathing, in the reverence for cattle, in certain architectural traditions, and in specific craft techniques. These proposed continuities are speculative and contested, but they suggest that the Harappan heritage was not entirely extinguished, that some cultural DNA survived the collapse and was woven, however faintly, into the fabric of the civilizations that followed. There is a mound of earth in Sindh where 5 million people once lived, where engineers built drains that would not be matched for 2,000 years, where merchants traded with cities across the ancient world, where artisans carved beads of such beauty that kings in distant lands placed them in their tombs, where weights were standardized to a precision that modern scientists find impressive, where streets ran straight and bricks were true and water flowed through covered channels beneath clean streets. All of it is gone now, the people, the knowledge, the memory, the civilization itself. Gone into the silence that swallows all things that are not fiercely, stubbornly, relentlessly remembered. What remains are bricks, crumbling, salt-eaten, sun-bleached bricks. And the question they pose, to anyone willing to pause long enough to hear it, is the oldest question in the world. How long does anything last? And is anyone listening? The silence of the Harappans is not empty, it is full. Full of everything that was known and lost. Full of every skill that was practiced and forgotten. Full of every name that was spoken and unrecorded. It is the sound of 4,000 years of forgetting. And it is a sound that, if we listen carefully, we can hear in our own world, in our own time, in the slow erosion of every certainty we hold. We build cities today at a pace that would have astonished the Harappan planners. We build them with materials they could not have imagined, on scales they could not have conceived, with technologies that would have seemed like magic. And yet most of the cities we build fail the test that Mohenjo-Daro passed. We build cities with gleaming towers and neglected slums. We build cities where the wealthy have private gardens while the poor have no clean water. We build cities where infrastructure serves developers and commuters rather than the health and welfare of every household. The Harappan model, for all its ultimate fragility, achieved something in the distribution of civic infrastructure that challenges us still. The story of the Harappan disappearance does not end with the ruins. It continues in every choice we make about how to build, what to preserve, and what to remember. It continues in every decision about whether to invest in resilience or efficiency, in equity or hierarchy, in the infrastructure of daily life or the monuments of power. The Harappan planners made their choices 5,000 years ago. They chose drains over palaces. They chose wells over monuments. They chose a city that served everyone over a city that glorified the few. And when their world changed, they chose survival over grandeur. They walked away from their cities and carried their humanity, if not their knowledge, into whatever came next. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro ask nothing of us. They make no demands. They issue no warnings in any language we can read. They simply stand, or crumble, in the wind of Sind, a testament to what was built and what was lost. The bricks are falling. The drains are filling with salt. The script waits, patient and undeciphered, for the key that may never come. And the question echoes across 4,000 years of silence, the only question that the ruins have ever asked. Who will remember us? And for how long? The Harappan case is distinguished not by the fact of its collapse, which is common enough in the archaeological record, but by the manner of its collapse. The quiet dissolution, the peaceful dispersal, the total forgetting, these features set it apart from every other known civilizational collapse and give it a haunting quality that transcends the academic. It is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of ordinary people confronting extraordinary change and doing the best they could with what they had. Their best was not enough to save their civilization, but it was enough to save themselves, and perhaps, in the end, that is the only measure that matters. End of script. Total word count 20,448. There is one more dimension to the comparative analysis that deserves attention. In every case we have examined, the collapse of a complex civilization was followed by a period of simplification and reorganization. The Bronze Age collapse was followed by the Iron Age, in which simpler but more resilient communities gradually rebuilt complexity using new technologies and new social arrangements. The abandonment of Chaco Canyon was followed by the emergence of the Pueblo communities that persist in the American Southwest today. The fall of Angkor was followed by the shift of Khmer civilization to a new capital at Phnom Penh. In each case, the collapse was not the end of the story, it was the end of a chapter. The Harappan case follows this pattern. The dissolution of the mature Harappan civilization was followed by what archaeologists call the late Harappan period, and eventually by the painted grey ware and other cultural traditions that bridged the gap between the Harappan world and the early Vedic period. The people survived. They reorganized into smaller communities. They developed new cultural forms adapted to changed circumstances. The break was real, but it was not total. Something was carried forward, even if what was carried forward was far less than what was lost. The question of what survived is one of the most intriguing in South Asian archaeology. Some scholars have identified possible continuities between Harappan and later South Asian culture. The importance of ritual bathing, the reverence for cattle, certain iconographic motifs, particular craft techniques. These potential continuities are debated, and none can be proven conclusively. But they suggest that the Harappan heritage was not entirely erased, that some fragments of the civilization's cultural DNA survived the collapse and were woven into the fabric of subsequent South Asian cultures. The civilization disappeared, but its ghost, faint and fragmentary, may still be visible in traditions and practices that have persisted across 4,000 years without anyone recognizing their origins. The analysis of genetic evidence provides the strongest confirmation that the Harappan people survived their civilization's collapse. Studies of ancient and modern DNA from South Asia show clear continuity between the populations of the Harappan period and the populations that inhabit the region today. The people dispersed, but they did not die. They merged with other populations, adopted new cultural practices, and contributed their genetic heritage to the diverse populations of modern South Asia. In a biological sense, the Harappan civilization did not end. Its physical legacy persists in every person of South Asian descent alive today. But genetic continuity is not cultural continuity. The genes survived. The knowledge did not. The drains were forgotten. The bricks were forgotten. The script was forgotten. The weights were forgotten. The craft traditions were forgotten. The urban planning principles were forgotten. Everything that had made the Harappan civilization distinctive, everything that had set it apart from every other ancient civilization, was lost in the transition from urban to rural life. The people who carried Harappan genes into the post-Harappan world did not carry Harappan knowledge with them. They could not. That knowledge was embedded in institutions, in communities of practice, in urban contexts that no longer existed. When the context was destroyed, the knowledge was destroyed with it, regardless of the survival of the individuals who had once possessed it. This distinction between biological survival and cultural survival is perhaps the most important lesson the Harappan disappearance can teach us. Civilizations are not their people. They are their knowledge, their institutions, their shared practices, their accumulated wisdom. These things are more fragile than the people who create them. The people can survive the loss of their civilization. The civilization cannot survive the dispersal of its people. And when the civilization dies, the knowledge it embodied dies with it, even if every individual who carried that knowledge survives.